Today on Locked On Red Wings, Steve Yzerman and Nicholas Lidstrom headline the Detroit Red Wings quarter-century team.
You're Locked On Red Wings, your daily podcast on the Detroit Red Wings. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome back to the Locked On Red Wings podcast. We are your hosts, Brian Fisher and Scotty Bentley. Scotty's the host over at Locked On Tigers, and I am a color commentator for Oakland University, ACHA, D1 men's hockey. And today, it's an off day, so we finally have a moment to breathe and talk about the Detroit Red Wings quarter-century team that was announced just last week. The NHL is slowly unraveling and revealing, I think is the better word to use there, each team's quarter-century team. And man, the Detroit Red Wings going back to the year 2000 have had some heavy hitters. Absolutely stacked rosters have been introduced, revealed. Probably one of the, if not the most stacked roster with tons of Hall of Fame names left off there on top of it, because there's only two teams, a starting lineup for both the first team and the second team of quarter-century players. And we'll break it down and give you our thoughts, talking about guys who maybe surprised us, were additions, as well as people we thought were kind of maybe snubbed. We'll see. I haven't really spoken to Scotty about it yet, so I don't really know what his thoughts are on the quarter-century team, kind of going into this blind, this episode. So, Scotty, why don't we just kick things off with the first team?
Yeah, I think when looking at, I don't know, I have a few knee-jerk initial reactions. Some, obviously a lot of positives. This is a storied franchise that has, even though lately not been as dominant, certainly for a stretch in this quarter century was, dang near unbeatable at one point. So there's obviously a lot of big names. Datsyuk, Yzerman, Zetterberg being the three forwards for the first team. Kronwall and Lidstrom, the two for the defensemen for the first team, and then Chris Osgood in net. Obviously, there's going to be some discourse about Ozzy versus Hasek in net. But outside of that, I didn't have too much of an issue with anything. I don't know. It just felt very, maybe predictable is the word. It just felt okay, this is, I think that these are probably going to be the names. Again, goaltender was going to be, one or the other based on what you were prioritizing there. But yeah, I know that Yzerman wasn't exactly what he was in the late 90s at the turn of the century, but were they really not going to have Yzerman in the first team? No. I think that was a pretty safe bet. So yeah, cool to see Datsyuk and Zetterberg together with Yzerman up the middle. I think that's pretty cool. But yeah, I think that it's nice to see them all written down, but I think it was relatively predictable.
It was chalk. Yeah, it was pretty chalk. I think Steve Yzerman, and there's going to be a conversation we're going to have about the primes of certain players, right? And I think Steve Yzerman's in that conversation. By no means will I ever come on here and be like, Steve Yzerman shouldn't have been on the quarter-century team. He's Steve F. and Yzerman. He is the captain. So I don't care that he played 5 seasons with Detroit after the turn of the century. No, they weren't his best seasons. He was definitely over the hill. He didn't crack 60 points in any of those seasons. So certainly there's a little bit of his legacy, what he did in the 80s and the 90s going into that decision. But he did win a cup in 2002. He captained that team that was absolutely stacked. And so I think that there's no realm where he's going to get left off this roster, even if he is past his prime at that point. And these rosters were made in the NHL's headline, in their article rather. The players who voted, it was selected by broadcasters, national, local, and NHL.com writers who have covered their respective teams in addition. So basically, your local media and national media selected these guys. And Steve Yzerman, okay, he was past his prime, but he's still Steve Yzerman, and that alone is going to get him a nomination onto the first team. The Chris Osgood one, nah, I don't have any problems with that over Dominik Hasek. You had two goalies. Dominik Hasek, obviously arguably the best goalie of all time in that conversation, right? But he only played parts of 4 seasons with Detroit past the year 2000. Won 2 cups with Detroit, but it was Chris Osgood that really heralded that team to the '08 Cup, right? Hasek got replaced by Chris Osgood. And Chris Osgood, I believe, played 7 seasons with Detroit past the year 2000, was a starter for quite a few of those years, and a good one at that. So when just comparing their tenures with the team past the year 2000, and just like where they were at in their careers. I mean, Osgood was definitely coming down a little bit in the 2000s. His prime was also in the 90s, but he was the better goalie, I feel, for Detroit in the 2000s. Dominik Hasek, much better career. Across the board, a better career than Chris Osgood. Will not argue that. But if we're doing a quarter-century team, then I have no problems with Chris Osgood being the first-team goaltender. But I know people will disagree. I know some people will say kind of similarly with the Steve Yzerman conversation, right? Like Yzerman was past his prime, but he's still in the first team, so why not Dominik Hasek? I think at that point it just comes down to tenure. And Chris Osgood was the more tenured goaltender with Detroit come the turn of the century, and they both won championships. Osgood still had more left in the tank. I don't have a problem with it.
Yeah, I think this is where we get into the debate of peak versus like amount of time played on the team at the turn of the century, right? Like you said, I mean, Hasek had what, 2 seasons? Well, I guess he came back, so 4 seasons with the Wings in the turn of the century. Obviously, that's nowhere close to the longevity, I guess I'll say, that Ozzy produced for the same team in that time frame. But like, Hasek won a Vezina in 01. Like, like, you know what I mean? Like he had a .921 save percentage and won a Vezina. So like, I get your point, and I get that the Ozzy had more playing time, and
he did not win that Vezina with Detroit though.
Yeah, right. Okay, so the year after, his save percentage, when it was still .915, he had 41 wins, which led that was the 02 season, which led the NHL. So like, yeah, fair point. He that was, I guess, the Vezina season itself was with Buffalo, but his stats are very similar, almost identical the year following, and that was his first year in Detroit. So like, I think again, it's just like peak versus length with team and total accumulated stats versus peak is always a debate. It's a big debate for like Hall of Fame voting. It's a huge debate for player rankings like this, and it certainly came into play here. So I don't have a huge issue with it, but I do think that, like, if you're going purely based on like who was the best goalie to ever play one single game in the quarter century, then your criteria probably changes there.
Yeah, and I think for me, I just goes back to Chris Osgood played longer with Detroit and had, I do struggle to say more success, right? Because Hasek did have 2 cups, but Osgood was the one who led them to the 08 Cup more so than Hasek. It just comes down, I think, the reason I'm okay with it is just based on tenure alone. The other 3 guys, Zetterberg, Datsuk, Lidstrom, absolute slam dunks. Did you have a problem with Nick Cronwall on the first team?
I didn't.
I
mean, we'll talk about the second team. I certainly think both guys there have a legit argument, but I don't know. To me, it's very, you can poke holes. You can argue for or against.
It depends on your criteria, like you were saying.
Right, everybody except Lidstrom. Like you can, like he's the one where it's like, okay, obviously he's gonna be on first team defense, and then the other 3 is kind of just a constant debate where you can argue for and against all 3 of them, I think.
Yeah, I think the only argument against Cronwall is just kind of like you were saying with Hasek, is like peak. It's like he never really reached, I don't think Cronwall ever really reached the same height as Chelios or Rafalski in his career, but he played with Detroit for 15 seasons, and all 15 seasons were with Detroit in the 2000s. He was an alternate captain. He played top line minutes for a long time, very physical defenseman. He was the number one defenseman. I didn't have a problem with it. Again, I think you just bring up such a good point. I think really what it comes down to is what is your criteria? So if people want to argue another defenseman over him or another goalie over Osgood or another center over Yzerman, unless you go out and say something ridiculous, I don't think I would fight you. If they're on first or second team, it doesn't really make much of a difference, really, if you swap them and their positioning. I think it just depends on what you're ranking them as.
For sure. And I do appreciate that, to your point there, that the voting on this list for the first team seems to be consistent in that regard, right? I mean, Cronwall and Ozzy both fit more of the former argument than the peak argument, right? So I think that that is consistency, at least with this list, which I can appreciate.
Yeah, and I do think they tried to balance too, the championship aspect of it. Because Cronwall did have a Stanley Cup in 2008. Yeah. Lidstrom had 2 cups, but that's not the same. The problem is there's no problem. Again, it's all just opinions in the end. But it's not necessarily super consistent on that criteria because you look at segment 2, right? We're talking about the second quarter century team, the second team quarter century team. Say team enough. And it feels like it's a little contradictory in some aspects, but again, it doesn't. We're splitting hairs over something that doesn't matter and is very cool in the end. So stay tuned to segment 2 of Locked On Red Wings. Super Bowl 59 is here. 1 game, 2 teams, endless possibilities. And there's no better way to make every play more exciting than with FanDuel Sportsbook. Whether it's predicting the first touchdown, calling the MVP, or even betting on the coin toss, FanDuel makes it easy to get in on the action. With live betting all game long, you can adjust your bets as the game unfolds and feel the thrill from kickoff to the final whistle. The live betting feature lets you stay involved no matter what happens on the field, and the app is super easy to navigate. Plus, knowing you can place a $5 bet and potentially win $200 in bonus bets for the Super Bowl, that's icing on the cake. Download the app or head to FanDuel.com today to get started. Bet just $5, and if you win, you'll score $200 in bonus bets. That's FanDuel.com. Bet with FanDuel, official sportsbook partner of Super Bowl 59. Segment 2, Locked On Red Wings podcast. We're going to move on to the second team quarter century roster for the Detroit Red Wings and kind of just give similar thoughts, surprise inclusions, or snubs. Scotty, who do we got in the second team?
Yeah, second team is Fedorov, Larkin, and Shanahan on the forward group, Chelios and Rafalski as the defensemen, and then, as we mentioned, Dominik Hasek in net. So I think, again, if this is where you start comparing and contrasting the two teams, right? Now that we have all the names out there, I mean, if you want to start with the forwards, I don't really have too much of an issue with the forward core. I think it's awesome to see Larkin there. And I think something that a lot of people were talking about online was that it's somewhat sad that you look at both of these teams and Larkin is the only player that has played in the last close to a decade. That's kind of a testament to what the team obviously has been for the last 8 to 10 years. But I mean, as far as the forward group, like I said, if you want to start there, I don't have too much of an issue. I think there's going to be some conversation and some dialogue about Fedorov. But I mean, I don't have an issue with the 3 they picked.
I mean, Fedorov is just another one. And here's the thing, who do you replace Fedorov with? Right. Who right now on the Red Wings do you replace Fedorov with? Who is a better option? Tatar? Nyquist? Franzen?
Right. I think that's an overarching theme is, people want to poke holes and be like, oh, well, it wasn't their peak. It wasn't this person's peak, though. And maybe they weren't as good, at the turn of the century as they were maybe in the 90s and whatever. And it's like, okay, well, over a third of this sample size, the Wings have been terrible. So you know what I mean? We're talking legitimately about over a third of this 25-year span at this point is not good at all. And you're not going to have anybody to really grab from. So I think that if you can legitimately argue somebody in that first decade, in that first 12 years, that deserves it more than one of those guys, I'm all ears. But, again, like, could even push it even a little further and say there's really nobody in the second half that we haven't already talked about that is going to make too much of an argument to be on the list.
Right. I mean, Sergei Fedorov, I think I saw only played like 4 seasons with Detroit after the turn of the century. Won the Cup with Detroit Red Wings in 2002. He was a better point producer than Yzerman was in those seasons. But it was 2001, 2002, 2003. Those are the only 3 seasons he played. He had 69, 68, and 83 points. Pretty productive seasons, 30 goals scored in each of those 3. And so, my first thought was, I'm surprised he's on here just solely because, the bulk of his prime came before the year 2000, and he only played 3 seasons past the turn of the century with the Detroit Red Wings. So, at first I was I'm actually surprised he's on here, given the fact that his tenure was so short. And then I'm like, okay, well, who else past the year 2000 was a better winger than Sergei Fedorov? Who on this roster?
Right.
Johan Franzen, Thomas Tatar, Gus Nyquist. I'm trying to think of notable, just not even Hall of Famers, notable wingers who have played with Detroit. Brett Hull, Bertuzzi.
I think legitimately there, if you're not going to go with somebody on this list and you're talking about what's left, Bird is honestly probably decently high on there if you're doing total Wings tenure.
And give it a couple more years. If Raymond had broken the year, was a couple years older and broken the league a few years before that, maybe he'd be on this list. I think he probably would be on this list given how good he has been this year. But I think he's just too young, too early in his tenure, and hasn't won anything. And that's the other big thing. He doesn't have any championships under his belt. I think that's why he's not on this list. And I think that's why Dylan Larkin is on the second team rather than the first team over Yzerman. Larkin's obviously played, a decade now with the Detroit Red Wings, 9-10 seasons with the Detroit Red Wings, and he's been very good. And his production, puts him amongst some very good names in the Detroit Red Wings franchise history, but he hasn't won anything. So that's why he's on the second team, as where Yzerman, he won a lot. Most of it was in the 90s, but that's why Yzerman is on the first team, is because Yzerman is Yzerman, and he won so much, even if it did come before the year 2000. So Fedorov, I just don't see who else you're going to put there. Larkin deserves to be on the list. I do believe that, because he's been with the team long enough, and he's been in the last, like you were saying, last third of this time span has been the only one that's been any good up until the last couple of years where Seider and Raymond burst onto the scene. But there's no one else from the current Red Wings that deserve to be on this list.
I agree.
Now, in the next quarter century list, Seider and Raymond are definitely going to be on here. If for whatever reason they had decided to do this from 2003 to 2028. Sorry to do 25 in my mouth really quick.
Why did you pick
I think
2003?
Well, I'm just trying to say, if you had shifted the window a few years, then I think they had made it. And then the next quarter century team from 2025 to 2050, I think they will be on there. But because their prime is going to be in this chunk right now. But that's the primary reason they're not on there yet, is they just haven't played long enough.
Yeah, it just don't fit the window really. There's toddlers that are going to be on that list right now. So we're looking pretty far ahead there. There's kids that are learning addition right now that are going to be on the 2050 list. So.
And some of them will never learn addition, as you just saw. It took me a solid 10 seconds to figure out what 2003 plus 25 was.
That's all right.
Scotty,
I do have one gripe with this list. Where's Matthias Brome?
Oh, shut up! God, you're
where is he? I'm confused on where is Brome on here? I'm very, and where's Giovanni Smith? I'm just confused.
You're a monster. Do you have any qualms with Brendan Shanahan being on that list?
No, honestly.
No,
I looked at. I thought the Fedorov argument, because of amount of time played. I guess Shanahan's not too terribly different. What was I don't know, had more legs than Shanahan, but I don't have an issue with either of them on there.
Yeah, Shanahan past the year 2000 played 6 seasons with Detroit, 5 seasons with Detroit, had 353 points in 3 games. Pretty much a lock to be on that list.
Yeah.
So he was very good in those last few years with Detroit. He scored 40 goals his final year with the team before going to the Rangers. That was at age 37. So, yeah, Shanahan, very good, deserves to be on the list. Any qualms with Chelios or Rafalski?
No. I think, again, the big question is, do either of them deserve it more than Kronwall? Not do either of them deserve to be on the list, period.
Yeah, I have no issues. There's no defenseman right now with the Detroit Red Wings besides Kronwall that is more recent than Rafalski or Chelios that deserves to be on the list. Seider will soon.
Throw DDK up there. Let's go.
I do love DDK. If they had a third team, I'd put DDK on there.
There
DDK and Seider. They were a pair for a year.
They were a pair. People forget that.
Rookie year for Seider. They were a pair. But Chris Chelios, I mean, he played from age 39 season in 2001 until he was 47 in 08-09. Won 2 cups with Detroit. Had 116 points. Yeah. Dude was past. You thought his prime was over. And you thought he couldn't do it anymore. And he just kept doing it. He just kept playing. He was playing 18 minutes a night at age 45. That's insane. And we all know Rafalski, short time with Detroit, but super impactful.
Yeah.
Only 4 seasons, but that guy was so good on Lidstrom's pair. So
I think there's an argument just for like sentimental reasons to just put Rafalski up with.
He was excellent. It wasn't just sentimental. I mean, he had 200.
No. I just mean from games. Like the perspective of you're making these lists, and it'd be cool to put him and Lidstrom together.
Right. Oh yeah, you mean like put that pair back together?
Yeah.
I got you. I mean, Lidstrom and Kronwall were a pair too after Rafalski.
Yeah, true.
So we're going to head to segment 3. I want to ask you, was there anyone you thought wasn't included on the list that maybe you thought should have been in consideration? Oh, okay. Well, I have one name.
Yeah, Matthias
one name.
Bromer. I already told you.
No, that's not. You know what? Segment 3 coming up. Damian Brunner. Attending NFL games is an unforgettable experience that brings fans together. Me, myself, Scotty, I've actually never been to an NFL game personally, which is a deep shame of mine. I really do want to go to a Lions game, but just not in the cards yet. But I am going to the Stadium Series game on March 1st down in Columbus, Ohio, and I got my tickets through GameTime. I used the GameTime Picks feature to find the best value seats, and it was a good spot too. I'm not in the lower bowl. I'm not that rich, but I got good seats in the upper bowl. Top 1% of value according to GameTime Picks, and the seats around me corroborate that story because the seats around me are going for a lot more. And I toggled on that all-in pricing toggle to make sure I knew exactly what I was paying going in to the checkout window, and I used that code LOCKEDONNHL to get $20 off my purchase. So take the guesswork out of buying tickets with GameTime. Download the GameTime app, create an account, and use code LOCKEDONNHL for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. Again, create an account and redeem code LOCKEDONNHL for $20 off. Download GameTime today. Last minute tickets, lowest price guaranteed. Segment 3, Locked On Red Wings podcast. Scotty, there's one name personally that I was a little bit shocked didn't make it. Shocked's not the right word, because when you compare the two that he's going up against, you can understand the arguments why of them over this name, and that name is Jimmy Howard. Jimmy Howard was a guy kind of similar to Nicholas Kronwall, where he played his entire career with Detroit and had a solid career. .912 save percentage, playing 14 seasons with the Detroit Red Wings. He was their starter through it all. He was second for the Calder in 2010. He was a good goalie. He was a solid goalie, and I think a lot because of the way his career ended, right? A lot of injuries, especially to his groin, and I think people forget how good Jimmy Howard was. So I was a little surprised to see somebody who played 14 seasons with the Red Wings and was good with the Red Wings in that span left off the list. But I do feel that in the end, a lot of that has to do with, championships, awards, and unfortunately, Howard has none. Even Kronwall has a Stanley Cup to his name.
Yeah. Yeah, I don't disagree with that. And I think, again, no, I don't want to just keep repeating myself over and over, but I think that just goes back to the initial, you know, quantity versus quality and total accolades versus peak and whatnot. Because if you're just doing tenure, then yeah, Howard absolutely is on there.
Yeah. But I mean, again, it just comes back to the conversation where when you consider peaks, Osgood and Hasek had better peaks, even if they were before the year 2000. When you consider accolades, the accolades for Dominic Hasek and Osgood were both much higher, and they both won championships, multiple championships. Osgood had 2 after the year 2000. So that's why it's just like I was, the word's not shocked, but slightly surprised he didn't get more consideration, but I'm not angry about it. I don't think it was the wrong decision, but I thought he is somebody who honorable mention, I think, is the right word to use for Jimmy Howard. Honorable mention. Any other honorable mentions that you could possibly have for the quarter century team?
Yeah, I'm surprised Corey Emerton's not on here
Oh,
somewhere.
you are ridiculous. You're just enjoying bringing up Jan Murzak. Where's Jan Murzak on here?
Dude, Corey Emerton got 56th the Lady Big Award. I don't know what we're talking about here. That's
Remember Trevor Daley on the Detroit Red Wings?
yeah.
That's crazy.
That is one word for it. Yeah.
Remember
I'm
Oli
just wondering, yeah, where Corey Emerton is. So, it's funny because with a lot of the in other sports, you see like the all decade teams or the all, quarter century, the all whatever specific year teams, et cetera, et cetera. You see them put together coaching staff, and obviously, I don't know if like nobody's doing it or if just the Wings didn't or whatever. But I'm curious, if you were to have one person behind the bench, I think that this is kind of another conversation that is, do you go with the person who won the most game with the Wings during that time frame, or do you go with somebody else? Because I think the immediate knee jerk would just be, Babcock's going to be behind the bench, which I'm not sure makes too many people happy.
Yeah, I mean, Scotty Bowman, best NHL head coach in league history, did win a cup with the Detroit Red Wings in 2002 and then immediately retired.
I'm cool with it.
I mean, he
we
coached the Red Wings
now at whatever. He's pushing 100. I say we put him out there now.
He only played
Legend
from the 2001 season and 2001-2002 season. Obviously, in the 2000s, Mike Babcock had more success with the Detroit Red Wings on a pure like tenure basis, right? Mike Babcock coached 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 seasons with Detroit. They made the playoffs every single year in his tenure, and they won a Stanley Cup. They went to 2 Stanley Cup finals. Scotty Bowman, since the year 2000, only went to 1 Stanley Cup final. So it would be first team, second team conversation all over again, right?
Sure.
Like Steve Yzerman makes the first team as center because a lot to do with his name, because we discussed it. At that point, he wasn't the player he once was, but he won a championship in 2002, and he was Steve effing Yzerman. You could make the same argument for Scotty Bowman. He won a championship in 2002, and he was Scotty effing Bowman.
Right.
Best coach to ever coach. So he could be the first team coach easily, with Babcock being the second team coach. Babcock's nowhere near the best coach to have ever made it, but like I said, he's made the playoffs every single year, went to back-to-back cup finals, won a cup.
Is the Red Wings all-time leader in wins as a head coach in any era.
You're really making me.
He is
don't make
number
me do
one all time, and so it's you know what I mean. Like it's one of those things where it's like how can you not go with Scotty Bowman? Because like again, that's just Red Wings. Scotty Bowman has whatever 1,200, 1,300 career wins. I mean, certainly if we're going full career, it's a lot different. And Scotty Bowman is the greatest to ever be behind a bench. So I think your argument is sound. The point that I was really trying to highlight was not I don't like speaking on Mike Babcock. So like I wasn't trying to just bring him up just for the heck of it. I think my point was that there's only really 2 to choose from. Like again, this is another one where it's like we can argue until we're blue in the face about who should be first team and who should be second team. And I think that it's very similar to a lot of the player conversations that were do go on peak or overall career. But at the end of the day, those two are the only two that are going to be on first team, second team. There's certainly nobody else in this 25-year stretch that deserves to be on said list. So,
yeah, I completely agree. That's the
Jeff
conversation.
Blashill, 6th all time in coaching wins in Red Wings history.
Well, I don't want to disparage Jeff Blashill, though he was given some pretty awful rosters there in the middle.
He sure was, man. He sure was.
Yeah, at the end of the day, looking at these rosters, you can nitpick, right? Talk about primes and tenures and legacies and championships. But at the end of the day, it's Sergei Fedorov, it's Steve Yzerman, it's Chris Chelios, some of the all-time greats, and those guys are always going to make the list. And I'm not gonna fight about it. He's just spent 30 minutes nitpicking, but overall, I'm fine with it, right? Nitpicking's our job, but overall, I'm fine with it.
I mean, genuinely, I'm sure I can listen back to this and just hear myself just pretty much say I don't have a problem with anything we put on here. Like, I think they did a good job. Like, I think the names are pretty much right. Again, I think you can kind of nitpick and argue about who should be on first team or second team, but as far as like the pure names that are on there, I think they pretty much nailed it, man.
Right. So why don't you guys nitpick down in the comments? Let us know who you think shouldn't be on the list, who you think should be on the list, or if you would change some of the players from first team and second team. Scotty, we were supposed to preview the Edmonton Oilers game. We went over time because we were just rambling. We tend to do that at times. But the Red Wings play the Edmonton Oilers tomorrow on Thursday. Big Western Canada road trip leading into the Four Nations face-off. So big road trip coming up, starts in Edmonton, and you're probably wondering, well, why are we talking about this if it's not until tomorrow? Well, that's because Scotty and I are taking a scheduled day off, kind of rewarding ourselves for some hard work recently. Just nice to have an extra day off every now and again. So there will be no Thursday episode. We will record after the Edmonton Oilers game and give you that recap then. So stay tuned for more. Oh, Scotty?
We ball.
Stay tuned for more. Same time, same place. It's your team every day.
Every day.